It is 6:36 on the 6th of June, 1944, and the ramp of a Higgins boat drops into the gray water off Omaha Beach. The men inside do not step onto sand. They step into the sea, waist deep, rifles held above their heads, and the first thing many of them hear is not an order, but the flat, tearing snarl of a German MG42 machine gun somewhere above them on the bluffs. It fires at 1,200 rounds a minute, so fast that individual shots blur into a single ripping sound, like canvas being torn apart by a giant hand. Bodies fall in the surf before their boots have found the sand. The tide is coming in behind them, and ahead of them lies a stretch of open beach, perhaps 90 to 100 meters of shingle and sand with almost nothing to hide behind. That will come to be remembered by the men who survived it simply as the deadliest 100 yards in American military history. This is the killing ground of Omaha Beach, and for the next several hours it will decide whether the largest amphibious invasion ever attempted succeeds or collapses into catastrophe. Understanding why this narrow strip of French coastline became such an efficient machine for slaughter, and how a broken, bleeding handful of men eventually crossed it, tells us something essential about the nature of industrialized warfare and about what ordinary soldiers are capable of when there is, quite literally, nowhere left to run. By the spring of 1944, the Allies had spent nearly 2 years planning the return to occupied France, and the problem they faced was not simply military, but geometric. Adolf Hitler's Atlantic Wall stretched for more than 2,000 kilometers, from Norway to the Spanish border, and German commanders had guessed correctly that Normandy was a plausible landing site, even if they remained convinced Calais was the more likely target. Field Marshal Erwin Rommel, given command of coastal defenses in late 1943, had inspected the existing fortifications and found them wanting. He believed the invasion had to be defeated on the beaches themselves in the first hours, before Allied forces could establish a foothold because once ashore in strength they would never be pushed back into the sea. Omaha Beach presented the Germans with a gift of terrain. Unlike the flatter beaches to the east and west, Omaha was overlooked by bluffs rising 30 meters above the sand, curving gently inward like the interior of a bowl, which meant that a defender positioned correctly could fire along the length of the beach rather than simply across it. Allied planners knew this. Naval and air bombardment before the landings was intended to neutralize German positions, but low cloud cover on the morning of the 6th meant Allied bombers, fearful of hitting their own troops in the water, dropped their loads too far inland, missing the coastal defenses almost entirely. Of the 32 amphibious duplex-drive tanks meant to support the first wave at Omaha, 27 sank in the rough seas before reaching shore, taking their crews down with them. The men who reached the beach did so largely without armor, without effective artillery support, and directly into the arc of fire the Germans had spent months preparing. Existing solutions, the doctrine of overwhelming pre-invasion bombardment, had simply failed to achieve what it promised, and the infantry paid the difference in blood. The defenses waiting for them had been designed with a particular and horrible elegance. The Germans called their strong points Widerstandsnester, resistance nests, and at Omaha these were numbered positions dug into the bluffs, connected by trenches and tunnels, built from reinforced concrete up to 2 meters thick in places. Widerstandsnest 62, overlooking the eastern section of the beach, is perhaps the best documented, and it illustrates the thinking behind the whole system. Its guns were not aimed to fire straight out to sea, which might seem the obvious choice, but angled along the beach itself, so that a soldier running for cover was running directly across the muzzle of a weapon rather than towards it. This is what military engineers call enfilade fire, and it is devastatingly efficient because a single machine gun position sighted correctly can cover hundreds of meters of open ground with overlapping fields of fire from other nests further along, so that there is no angle of approach that is not covered from at least 2 directions at once. The primary weapon in these positions was the MG42, a machine gun developed by the German firm Grossfuss and introduced in 1942 weighing around 11.5 kilograms, roughly the weight of a large dog, yet capable of a cyclic rate of fire nearly double that of most Allied equivalents. American soldiers, more accustomed to the far slower rattle of the Browning, nicknamed it Hitler's buzzsaw for the sound it made, a sound so continuous that individual bullets could not be counted by ear. Feeding this weapon required a crew working in practiced rhythm, one man firing while another fed belts of ammunition and a third watched for targets and adjusted range, and German positions on the bluffs were stocked with tens of thousands of rounds, dug deep enough into the chalk and clay of the Normandy coastline that naval gunfire, however heavy, struggled to reach them directly. Beyond the machine guns lay obstacle belts on the beach itself, steel and timber structures nicknamed Czech hedgehogs and Belgian gates, many rigged with teller mines, designed to gut landing craft before they could even reach the sand, forcing men to disembark further out and wade further through open water under fire. Mortar positions, sited on reverse slopes where they could not be seen from the sea, added plunging fire to the horizontal killing zone of the machine guns, meaning there was no posture, standing, crawling, or lying flat, that offered reliable safety. It was, in the cold language of military engineering, a mutually supporting defense in depth, and in the more human language of the men who faced it, it was simply a slaughterhouse with no roof. What followed on the beach itself has been documented in fragments, because so many of the men who witnessed the worst of it in the first wave did not survive to describe it, and because the chaos of combat resists tidy narrative. Companies of the 1st and 29th Infantry Divisions, the Big Red One and the Blue and Gray, landed in the wrong places, scattered by tide and current, so that entire units found themselves isolated, leaderless, and pinned against the shingle bank that ran along much of the beach's upper edge, the only real cover available. Company A of the 116th Infantry Regiment, landing at the section of beach codenamed Dog Green, suffered such catastrophic losses in the first minutes, some accounts suggest the company was rendered combat ineffective within 20 minutes, that survivors later called it Bloody Omaha, a name that stuck to the entire sector. For nearly 2 hours, by most accounts, the invasion at Omaha hung in genuine doubt, with senior officers offshore considering whether to abandon the beach entirely and redirect follow-up waves elsewhere. What changed the outcome was not a single dramatic breakthrough, but an accumulation of small, desperate acts. Destroyer captains bringing their ships dangerously close to shore, in some cases scraping their keels on the sea bottom, to bring naval guns to bear directly on the bluffs, and junior officers and non-commissioned officers, cut off from higher command, making the decision to stop lying against the shingle and start moving, because staying meant dying regardless. Colonel George Taylor, landing later that morning, is remembered for a line that captured the brutal logic of the moment, telling the men around him that there were only two kinds of people on that beach, the dead and those who were about to die, so they had better start moving. Small groups began cutting through wire, finding gaps in the bluffs, and working their way up in 2s and 3s rather than in formation, because formation was simply a way of dying together. By early afternoon, though the beach was still under fire, the crust of the German defense had been cracked, not shattered, but cracked, enough for the invasion to continue. If you are finding this interesting, a quick subscribe helps more than you know, and it costs nothing but a moment of your time. It is worth pausing to compare what happened at Omaha with the other 4 invasion beaches that same morning, because the contrast is instructive. At Utah Beach, to the west, currents pushed the first wave nearly 2 kilometers from their intended landing zone, and by accident this proved fortunate, delivering troops to a stretch of coast far more lightly defended, with casualties in the low hundreds rather than the thousands. At the British and Canadian beaches, Gold, Juno, and Sword, specialized armor nicknamed Hobart's Funnies, including tanks fitted with flails to clear mines and bridging equipment to cross obstacles, landed successfully alongside the infantry in ways the duplex-drive tanks at Omaha largely failed to, giving those forces armored support from the earliest minutes ashore. German defenses elsewhere along the invasion front were, in most sectors, simply less developed than at Omaha, where the terrain itself had encouraged a uniquely thorough defensive scheme. It is also worth noting that the German MG42 was not unique to Omaha. It was standard issue across the Wehrmacht and would go on to influence post-war general-purpose machine gun design so directly that the American M60 and the German Bundeswehr's own MG3 both borrowed heavily from its belt-feed mechanism and quick change-barrel system. In this sense, the weapon outlived the war that made it infamous, becoming a template rather than a relic. Casualty figures for Omaha remain, even today, somewhat contested, with estimates for American dead, wounded, and missing on the 6th of June ranging from around 2,000 to slightly higher, depending on which records and which time frame historians use. A reminder that even an event as extensively documented as D-Day contains genuine uncertainty at the level of precise numbers. The impact of those hours at Omaha extended well beyond the beach itself. Tactically, the near failure at Omaha forced Allied commanders to recognize, more sharply than perhaps any other sector of the invasion, the limits of pre-assault bombardment against fortified positions, a lesson that would shape planning for subsequent operations in the Pacific and in later stages of the European campaign. Psychologically, the survival of the beachhead, achieved by such a narrow margin, became central to how the Normandy invasion was remembered, not as a smoothly executed plan unfolding to schedule, but as a close-run thing rescued by improvisation and individual courage at the point of contact. The bluffs above Omaha are still there, and the remains of Whiterstan's Nest 62 can still be visited today, its concrete casemate looking out over what is now a quiet, sandy beach with the American cemetery at Colville-sur-Mer resting on the high ground behind it, row upon row of white crosses and stars of David marking those who did not get across the 100 yards. What is harder to preserve, and what no monument can fully capture, is the specific, granular terror of that morning, the sound of the MG42, the weight of wet wool uniforms dragging men down in the surf, the particular helplessness of running across open sand towards guns that could not miss for long. Return, for a moment, to that ramp dropping at 0636. The water is cold, the sound above is a tearing, continuous snarl, and ahead lies 100 yards of nothing, no cover, no shelter, only sand and shingle and the long, patient arithmetic of interlocking machine gun fire. What makes this stretch of coastline matter, decades later, is not simply the scale of the killing, though the scale was immense, but the fact that it was crossed at all. It was crossed by men who had every reason to stay down and did not, by officers who improvised when their plans disintegrated in the first 10 minutes, by destroyer crews who broke standing orders to bring their guns close enough to matter, and by an accumulation of small, unglamorous decisions made under fire that no textbook could have fully prepared anyone for. The 100 yards did not become easier to cross as the morning wore on. It simply became, eventually, survivable, one exhausted, terrified group at a time. That is the story of Omaha Beach, told not in the language of grand strategy but in the language of distance, 90 meters, 100 yards, the space between the tide line and the base of the bluffs, and it remains, in the truest sense, ground that had to be paid for, step by step, in a currency that cannot be recounted in any museum. The deadliest 100 yards of the war was crossed not because it stopped being deadly, but because enough men decided that standing still was worse.